I rise today to talk about the FAA reauthorization bill that has been debated all morning, that's been being discussed. I want to thank Chairman Rockefeller, Chairman Dorgan, ranking members Hutchinson, DeMint for their hard work on this very critical legislation. I share the concerns that were raised by Chairman Dorgan as he spoke on the floor about the need to advance this legislation and implement a number of these vital improvements to the safety and security of our entire aviation system. Madam President, on the night of February 12th, 2009, Continental Flight 3407, operated by Colgan Air, departed Newark Airport, bound for Buffalo, New York. The 45 passengers and 5 crew members were just a few miles from the airport when a series of events resulting in the death of all aboard, as well as the father on the ground, whose home was the unfortunate final resting place of Flight 3407. Over this last year, I've gotten to know many of the families of the victims of this crash. They are a constant presence here in Washington, working to improve safety conditions so that others are spared from the horror and loss that they've experienced. Sitting in my office last spring as the National Transportation and Safety Board began to release information about the crash, I discussed with the families the tremendous value of their advocacy. For decades, the system has been slow to change, and in the meantime, innocent lives, like their loved ones, have been lost. We discussed the possibility of seizing on this legislation as a vehicle for change to bring accountability and transparency to the system, to strengthen the training requirements, and push forward achieving not just one level of safety, but a higher level of safety. That conversation began a year-long campaign by the families who, on their own dime, have been here at every aviation safety hearing, both in the Senate and in the House, and have frequented senators' offices with a steadfast determination to turn this tragedy into the clarion call for change. Madam President, we must remember the people who we lost in the Buffalo crash: an expecting mother, a community health advocate, a young couple in love, an international human rights leader, a second-year law student. These were our mothers, our fathers, our brothers, sisters, sons, and daughters taken so suddenly, their passions and their dreams left for those closest to them to now honor and pursue. Beverly Eckert died in the crash. She was a national leader who took her personal tragedy of losing her husband on September 11th and became a leading advocate for the 9/11 families. She was on her way to Buffalo that night to celebrate her husband's birthday with her family and to honor a student at Canisius High School with a scholarship named after her husband. Jerry Nywood was a noted jazz musician, Rochester native, and graduate of the Eastman School of Music at the University at Buffalo. Jerry was on his way to Buffalo to join his longtime friend and Grammy winner Chuck Mangione in concert with the Buffalo Philharmonic Orchestra. Madam President, the details that surround this tragedy of Flight 3407 have been well documented and well debated in these halls. We know that for the 2 days prior to that night, the captain, who had a history of training failures, had not slept in a bed, commuting from his home in Florida. We know that the co-pilot, who complained of being ill during that trip, had also not slept in a bed the night before, commuting from her home in Seattle with a stop in Memphis to her duty station at LaGuardia. Madam President, I don't know of many jobs, especially those where people's lives are on the line, that these can be done under such stressful circumstances. Although not specifically addressed in this underlying the bill, the issue of commuting and duty time is but one of the factors that came together to result in this tragedy. Working with my colleague, Senator Schumer, we have advanced legislation that would raise the minimum standards for new commercial pilots. A version of this proposal, which was endorsed by the families of Flight 3407, has been secured in this underlying legislation. The new standards would increase the minimum flight hours for commercial hires from the current 250 hours to 800 hours for co-pilots. Apart from just more flight time experience, these new regulations would increase the quality of that training, not just the quantity. The proposal requires the administrator of the FAA to engage in rulemaking that requires beyond the 8 hours minimum pilots must demonstrate effective operation of aircraft in multi-pilot conditions, in adverse weather conditions, including icing conditions, as was the case here in Flight 3407, high-altitude operations, and basic standards of cockpit professionalism and operations in part of the airline industry. A major concern that I share with the families is that oftentimes, when left to their own, the FAA has a poor track record in acting on updating regulations. This legislation will give the FAA until the end of next year to enact these new regulations, of more stringent set of regulations that will become the across-the-board standard. Also, included in this bill is the crux of the Flight 3407 Memorial Act, my legislation that will require the FAA to report back to Congress on all new safety recommendations issued by the NTSB's investigative reports. Time and time again, the FAA has failed to enhance training requirements and other safety measures when they have been recommended. The version of the reporting requirements that I secured in the underlying bill will not only require that the FAA respond to the NTSB recommendations, but let the American people know what actions they are taking and the timeline by which those actions will be made. This will ensure that the voices of the families who have suffered such grave loss are not only heard, but responded to. Instituting this level of oversight is critical as we look to assure that the families of Flight 3407 and all Americans who travel by air, that those responsible for acting on the recommendations of safety experts are not simply filing those recommendations away in a filing cabinet, never to see the light of day, but that they are listening and they are implemented so we have safer standards and procedures. Madam President, I am very grateful for the work of the Commerce Committee and the leadership for bringing this important bill forward. The steps taken in this legislation begin to address the culture of inaction that helped to contribute to the crash just outside Buffalo. It is time to learn the lessons of the past, change the culture of inaction, and make air travel safer for all American families. We owe it to those lost to never forget and to continue our work to address these serious concerns raised over the last year. I look forward to seeing these improvements contained in this critical legislation.